Hello and welcome to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. This is a very detailed video about how I painted Black Panzer uniforms, an oak leaf camouflaged overall, skin tones and much more. So, if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. These are the figures I will paint in this video, the Panther crew by Dynamo Models. The box of the 4 figures is full with parts and accessories like pistol holsters and maps, and the coolest thing, 10 heads and spare hands in different poses holding different things, so you can switch parts and make your figures a bit more unique. Like I know it from Dynamo Models, the figures themselves have nice details like ranks, insignias and medals. I started with removing the usual casting residues and small cleanups of casting seams. Then I glued all parts in place, making sure the parts fit as good as possible. Bergswerk superglue and activator spray were like always an unbeatable duo here. The unavoidable gaps were then closed with Tamiya smooth putty, pushed in place with a moistened toothpick. As you can see, I this time even glued the heads in place instead of painting them separately. I wanted to try it this way because I don't like it to mess around with superglue on painted parts, and I sometimes damage the paint job on the neck area when fitting the heads into the collars. But I was aware that the painting wouldn't become easier now. So after the assembly with all gaps filled, I drilled holes into their feet and glued metal pins in there, to place them onto corks for better handling while painting. But first I had to clean them to remove dust and dirt and grease from my fingers. So I gently washed them in soapy water with a soft brush and gave them a thorough cleaning. Modeler's World degreaser is perfect for removing the last bit of dirt and grease, making the figures super clean. You can either spray it with an airbrush or like me here for an additional mechanical cleaning by brush. It not only cleans the figures perfectly, it also seems to roughen the surface somehow, making it easier for the paint to adhere on this smooth resin surface. I always like to use a lacquer based primer because they spray well, adhere good and give a nice smooth finish. This time I used a light grey primer instead of the dark brown one I usually use. Why? Well, no particular reason, except that I had this stuff in my stash and wanted to use it. But the choice of the primer color wasn't that important this time, as I wanted to make a pre-coloring, and that would be pretty dark for Black Panzer uniforms anyway. 3 out of the 4 guys were wearing the Black Panther uniforms, and for the mentioned pre-coloring I mixed me a very dark shadow paint. I used AK Real colors here, diluted with Modeler's World leveling thinner because they work great together. This shadow paint was then sprayed onto the whole uniform as a base coat, making sure it's covering all areas, especially the deeper and darker ones. For the highlights I mixed a slightly lighter color and again diluted it to a good spraying consistency. This highlight paint was then sprayed from above in a flat angle, so it only hits the raised and exposed areas that would be hit by light. But this step not only emphasized the lighter areas, it also gave the figures more contours and contrast. And although the effect is rather subtle here, it's just enough to give me an idea where to place the shadows and highlights in the following brush painting stage. But before I started with shadows and highlights, I made filters with very diluted dark grays and even black over the individual uniform parts to bring some variation in the same looking clothes after the pre-coloring. Like this, I wanted to avoid ending up with 3 guys looking like they just came out of the uniform store with 3 brand new equal looking uniforms. And here you can see the subtle color variation between jackets and pants on the single figures. Now I could start adding the shadows and I used a dark, almost black gray for this. I diluted the paint with retarder like always, so it stays workable longer and doesn't dry too fast, leaving tight marks. At the beginning I diluted the paint with more retarder to slowly get a feeling for the opacity of the paint, looking how it acts when it dried out. The paint always looks way stronger when it's wet, so I applied it, let it sit for a few minutes and then decided if the paint retarder ratio was okay or if I had to add more paint or retarder to the mix. And if in doubt, I'd rather apply 2 thin layers instead of ending up with one too thick and covering one. And my good old blending brush was helpful again with blending the edges and smoothing out the transitions. And I use this dark color to paint shadows on all black uniform parts, no matter what color I used for the variation filter on the specific piece. Before I started with adding the highlights, I used pure black paint to refine seams and outline details, emphasizing them this way. The paint was again slightly diluted with retarder so it flows better off the brush and can be removed in the case I had to make corrections. And the reason why I did this step before adding the highlights was that I could make corrections with the highlight paint if necessary. To paint the highlights, I used the paint I made the variation filter with on the specific uniform part and added a good amount of light grey paint. This lighter version of the filter paint was then applied, again diluted with retarder. I here too started with thinner paint, checked how it looked when it dried out and made another pass if necessary or changed the retarder paint ratio. I applied the highlight paint onto all areas that were raised or bent upwards and because of that exposed to light. And again I used my blending brush to smoothen out the transitions. It makes a difference if I use the blending brush dry or moistened with retarder. Dry for smooth blending while still wet and moistened when the paint doesn't react anymore and I need to reactivate it again. To unify shadows and highlights and integrate them into the surface, I used AK's black ink and applied it glaze-like over the whole uniform. The ink was very heavily diluted because it's very strong and covering when used pure. And because it dries super fast, I had to work fast and in sections so I don't end up with hard tight marks. The reason why I used this black ink instead of acrylic paint is that the ink gives a deep and rich black finish, giving the uniforms a nice black look, but letting the painted highlights shine through. The last step on the black uniforms was to emphasize raised details and seams, and I here used pure highlight paint, just slightly diluted and refined the raised parts of seams, edges of pockets and lids. This brought these details forward into the viewer's eyes, making them stand out more and giving the uniform parts more sharpness and contours. And I could also use this paint to highlight specific areas of the uniforms that would be a bit brighter than the rest, like folds and edges, adding some more depth and contours here too. And to integrate these highest uniform highlights into the surface, I made another second glaze with very strong diluted black ink. It was so heavily diluted that it was almost pure tap water, so it's just strong enough to integrate the highlights into the surface without eliminating them completely. With the uniforms done, I could finally start to paint the details, a job I always love to do, especially when they are nicely sculpted like on these figures. Parts like ranks, insignias and ärmelbänder were base painted with black. And the details worked out with off-white and a super fine brush. Sometimes I applied the paint more in a stippling motion to apply it spot on onto the small details like the ranks on collars and shoulders or the double flash. Metal ribbons were painted for Iron Cross's second class and an KVK second class, so we have some veteran troops here. For the metallic details like the rank of this Obersturmführer, what equals to First Lieutenant or Oberleutnant, I switched to my metallic brushes and cleaning water. It's better to not mix normal and metallic paints, because the metallic pigments will stay in the brushes forever, and I don't want these in my good expensive brushes. So, next to the ranks, all metallic details like buttons, medals and insignias were painted with these brushes. The commander is wearing the Wounded Badge or Verwundetenabzeichen in gold, so again a highly experienced combat veteran. And I'm really sorry if the footage isn't perfect sometimes, but it's really hell to paint these small details and get proper video material of that process at the same time. To knock down the strong metallic shine, I put a very thin layer of black ink on top of the metallic details. This was supposed to knock down the shine and give the parts some depth. And to not accidentally overdo it, I made several thin applications here until I was satisfied with the result. And the last step for the details was to carefully paint the pink piping or Paspellierung to recognize them as tank troops. Needless to say that I tried to work as accurate as possible in the detail painting stage. Especially metallic paints have no mercy when doing mistakes. But in general, corrections can be done relatively easy with the surrounding paints if something went wrong. Leather parts. Boots and belts were made from leather and I base painted them with a dark brown paint. Next I applied a lighter brown tone, diluted in equal parts with retarder onto all areas except the deepest spots and crevices. Like this, the dark base paint sets the shadows and emphasizes the deepest spots. The retarder makes this lighter paint slightly translucent, letting the dark base paint shine through for a nice effect of depth. This light brown paint was then lightened up in 3 steps with an orangish brown paint and applied onto the more exposed and raised areas. Each time the paint became lighter, the painted areas became smaller, emphasizing the raised areas like this. And as a last step I used the pure orange brown to paint scratches and wear and tear into the parts with a super fine brush. To unify shadows and highlights and integrate the wear and tear into the parts, I made a glaze with a warm brown tone, giving the pieces a nice brown finish. I made sure that the glaze wasn't pooling in the deeper spots and covering the shadow paints by collecting the pooling paint with a dry brush. And with that the leather parts were done. And with that the 3 black uniform guys were done for now. It was great fun painting all the details like ranks, ribbons and awards, and please don't ask me how I managed to paint the clock hands, just believe me, I somehow did it. The brown leather parts make a nice contrast, bringing some color into the dark appearance. Now I could actually start painting the skin tones on these guys, but I first had to paint the 4th guy and his camouflage overall to paint the skin tones on all 4 figures together. Should we skip him and jump right to the skin tones, or do you want to know how I painted him? No matter what you say, I will show it anyway, so let's get started. On this figure I too made a pre-coloring as a foundation because I wanted to set the first shadows with this step already. So again I applied the darker shadow paint as a base paint over the whole overall. And by spraying the highlight paint from above I had a good starting point for the camouflage painting with the first soft shadows in place and some more depth and contours on the figure. Of course, pre-coloring this figure is totally optional and basically unnecessary, as I later learned, but now I tried it and know it for sure. Before I started the camouflage, I first used black paint to outline details and repaint seams. I here could still be pretty messy because I could make corrections easily when painting the camouflage. But of course I tried to be as accurate as possible to avoid unnecessary corrections and to train my brush hand. Now I could start painting the pattern, and I started with painting large dark and medium green spots. You might have noticed the reference pictures on my table already, and references are essential for jobs like these. I used pictures of real overalls and works from Jaume Ortiz here because I really like his paintings. The bigger dark and middle green spots were painted on places where my reference showed me to place them, and I tried to create irregular edges by stippling the paint in place. This looks pretty wild now, but most of these spots will be covered in huge parts by the light green spots later, so I had to trust the process and continue to work. And I here could already make corrections where the black outlines didn't come out perfectly. Next I added the bright green spots on top of the darker ones. I tried to apply the bright green spots not completely covering the dark ones, because these should still be visible, breaking up the bright green spots. And stippling the bright green paint in place was helpful here too. The paint was slightly diluted so it flows better off the brush, and I made sure the tip of my brush was super pointy all the time. Next I used the medium and dark green again to break the bright green spots even more into many little pieces by connecting the darker areas that were still visible or painted new ones. Unlike on the plain tree camouflage, the bright green on the oak leaf pattern is interrupted and separated in many small areas, and I tried to paint these small details, breaking the bright green here. Into the areas between the green spots, small dark brown and dark green spots were placed randomly. These spots are not that big in amount like on the P-dot camouflage, but they are clearly there and have to be added. I tried to avoid adding them in a specific pattern and placed them into all areas, lighter and darker ones. In these dark spots, bright green and bright brown spots were placed, smaller than the darker ones, making sure the dark outline was still visible. The bright brown spots were painted in the highlight paint from the pre-coloring, so the beige base paint of the suit. And with that, the basic camouflage was painted and I could start refining it with shadows and highlights. The whole camouflage was now in the same light or shadow level, and to bring in the shadows, I mixed me a dark and very diluted wash. I checked the opacity on my palette and then started to apply it over the whole surface. But before touching the figure with the brush, I unloaded it on a paper towel because I didn't want to flood the whole surface with the wash pooling in the crevices. I wanted an equally applied filter-like layer. If you look at the shadow and light levels like a building, I am right now creating the basement by adding the darkest colors. I will in the next steps add the ground floor with medium light colors and finish my building with the highlight paints for the roof on top. I hope this makes sense and doesn't sound too silly. With the shadows done, I now had to bring in the first lighter paints or the ground floor to stick with the building comparison. I grabbed me some acrylic paints matching to the real colors I made the highlight paint for the pre-coloring with, and with these mixed me the base paint again. If you would have applied one base paint by brush instead of the pre-coloring I did, you would use this paint now again to create the ground floor layer. The reason why I switched to acrylics here is because they brush better, with the real colors drying faster than I can work when applying them by brush. Anyway, with the beige base paint, I repainted all areas of the overall that would receive at least some light, leaving only the darker areas and crevices in the dark shadow layer. The same was done with the bright green spots. I used the same bright green paint I used a few minutes ago, and with that repainted all bright green spots that would receive at least some light, bringing them back into the brighter ground floor colors. Yes, I basically repainted most of the camouflage, and yes, this was time consuming. But it was also great fun to paint, and seeing the contrast develop, I saw that it was totally worth the effort. I then added some sunny skin tone to the just used medium bright paints to create the highlight or roof paint. With these light paints I repainted the most to light exposed and therefore brightest areas like the tips of folds or parts that were bent upwards like shoulders, pocket lids or the top of the back. This step also added a lot more contours to the camouflage because it emphasized the figure's shape with the contrast between the darkest and lightest areas. And by adding sunny skin tone to the bright green, I created a highlight paint I repainted the bright green spots with. Spots that were in areas that would receive more light and should be brighter than the ground floor. And as the last step I used sunny skin tone to repaint seams and outline details like pockets and lids. It was really helpful that all these details were nicely sculpted and therefore more easy to paint. And this last step gave the overall more sharpness and crisp, separating the individual parts optically from another. And after painting the leather parts and details like on the other figures, all these steps brought me to this point, the figures ready for skin tones. Like I said, this was a lot of work, but also super fun. And totally worth the effort, as I consider this camouflage as the best I painted so far. In the past I worked with washes to bring in the shadows, but was too lazy to repaint the rest with brighter colors, only adding a few highlights here and there. I am super happy now that I finally pushed myself to give it a try, and the result convinced me that much that I will follow the Jomi Ortiz way of painting from now on all the camo patterns I will paint. So, skin tones next. In the past I tried around a lot with different color palettes and techniques, because I somehow wasn't able to achieve constant and satisfying results. Good phases were followed by, well, not so good ones, at least to me. This time I tried to combine paints I used in different figure projects in the past, hoping to end up with a good result that is repeatable in future projects. So, let me show you what I tried out this time. Before I started with the skin tones at all, I painted the eyes white, because I could then make easy corrections with the base paint. I used a dark fleshy paint to then base paint all skin areas including the hands and making necessary corrections around the eyes. With the slightly lighter paint I painted all areas that would receive some light except the darkest areas like under the chin or eyes that would stay in the darker tone. And with an even lighter paint I painted the most raised and to light exposed areas like the forehead, back of the nose, cheeks and chin. Until this point I did very few blending. This will be done later, so it's looking pretty wild. And until this point the used paints were the same like in my younger figure projects. That would change with the next steps. To unify shadows and highlights and smoothen out transitions, I used the power of glazes. I applied the paint very strong diluted over the whole skin area, blending it into place gently with a dry, soft brush. I used Flow Improver here as a thinning medium because it acts similar to retarder but dries faster. And this was helpful here because I built up this effect in several layers until I was satisfied. The paint I used here was Flat Flash, a paint with an orangish touch. I used that paint a lot in my older figure projects and I remembered that the result was not that bad. So I thought I'd give it a try here. I then started to add the red tones to the face for some rosiness and to bring some life into it. In the past I used thin pure red paint for that, what wasn't really bad, but I here mixed it with Flat Flash, first in equal parts, and applied it thin into the shadowed areas. When the first layers were applied, I added more red to the mix and placed that into the darkest areas. From now on I used retarder as thinning medium because I wanted longer control over the paint to have more time to blend it. Again I built up the effect in several layers until I was happy with the coverage and look. And as the last step for the skin tones, I mixed the highest highlight paint and with that went over the highest and brightest areas like the forehead, back of the nose, ears, chin and so on. Again, like always, the paint was diluted and applied in several layers, blended for smooth transitions until I was satisfied with the result. To add the last details I added a bearded shadow with a dark bluish grey mix. This was applied really super thin, heavily diluted with retarder, so I can blend it in place and applied it in several layers with a short drying time in between. Again I built up the effect until I was satisfied. And I added the bearded shadow only to 2 figures to get some variation into the faces, creating a difference of how strong the beard growth is on the different faces, or how much time passed since the last shave. To paint the eyes I used my proven method I showed several times in my videos. I applied a small dot of dark brown oil paint with a 000 brush into the eyes white, as accurate as possible. And with a thinner moistened 00 brush I reworked sides and shape of the pupil and could easily remove the paint if it came out completely useless. Like this, I have almost endless tries until I am satisfied with the result. I also quickly painted the hair, eyebrows and the commander's head and then went on to the final steps. Although these guys are sitting in a tank most of the time, I think they should be slightly dirty from walking around the vehicle and wading through the wet summer mud, especially as this scene will take place outside of the tank. So I used a light earth tone and with a small dry brusher stippled the paint into the areas where I thought it would match. The brush was pretty dry and this was basically a dry brushing by stippling. I then grabbed me a darker earth tone and stippled this into the lighter one previously applied. Like this, I wanted to achieve more variation and depth. Again, the brush was very dry, like you would do it on a dry brushing. To unify the weathering of the figures with the later vehicle and diorama, I used the same pigments by Modeler's World I will use there. I applied the pigments by stippling them in place, and this also blended the previously applied acrylic paints better and smoother into the surface. I used the matching pigment fixer not only to secure the pigments in place, this also helped to knock down the dusty appearance the pigments gave the figures. And here you can already see the guy holding his map. So let me give you a quick insight how I made it. I did not use the resin piece that came with the set and was supposed to represent a newspaper for several reasons. It didn't match the figure's hands like I glued them into position, it was pretty thick and I had to paint some kind of newspaper or map on top of it. And I could not imagine that I could do that so it's looking good afterwards. Instead I decided to create my own map and not a newspaper, because it was more matching to the scene I have in mind for these figures and I was more flexible with the shape, size and position. Therefore, I grabbed me Getz black magic metal and some map decals of the Caen area, Normandy. So I cut out the decal and a matching piece of black magic metal and painted it on both sides in a base paint matching to the background color of the map. After brushing on some glossy varnish, I applied the decal with the micro set and micro sole, and after drying, finished the piece with Bergswerk's matte varnish for a nice flat finish. Now I could carefully bend the map into the required size and shape. Luckily, the decal was very flexible. My fear was that it would break or split, but that didn't happen. And I used the original resin part to bend it slightly into shape. I then slided the map into the figure's hands and I was very nervous in advance here, because I was worried to rub off the paint at his hands or even break the hands loose completely. Luckily, with some patience and steady hands, it worked out pretty well. And with this bit of extra effort I was able to create a solution that looked way better to me than a hand-painted piece. And that's it for today. I am super happy with the result on these figures. I again learned a lot, especially on painting the camouflage this way. I really like the result, but already see things I can try to make better the next time. The skin tones came out nice too, at least to me, and I think I will try to improve the use of this color palette in future figure painting projects. If you made it until here, thank you very much for watching. I hope my video was interesting to watch and maybe even helpful and you could learn a thing or two. If you like what you saw, I would be very happy if you support me by subscribing, and I am curious to read your feedback and thoughts to my tank crew. Und nein, das gibt es nicht auch auf Deutsch. So, enough said for today. Thanks again for watching. Have fun with your own figure painting projects. Stay safe and until the next time.